So in 2020, we're going to have this 10-point DBQ that you're going to write in about 45 minutes. So the timer will actually count down from 50, but the 5 minutes that are remaining, they're strongly recommending that you try to submit during those 5 minutes. The timer will turn red to alert you to the fact that it has gone down to a 5-minute countdown. What I've recommended that you do, and what some of you have already done in the practice DBQs, is you open one window on the left, that's the documents, and you open another window on the right, probably a Google Doc, where you're going to type the essay. So what that means is, if you have the window on the right, that's the essay, you could keep typing even after the timer expires. You just wouldn't be doing anything that can score. So College Board has actually recommended that you have somebody else in the room with you so that they can tell you, they can keep an eye on the timer with you, or maybe set a timer on a watch or a phone so that you know when it's time to move on. All right, so I'm going to run through each of the points. I'm going to run through them in the order that you would write them in the essay, and as much as possible. So the first point is the contextualization point. And so the College Board definition is paraphrased there for what scores as contextualization. You will notice that it does not say that the information has to come from prior to the time frame. A lot of you have approached it that way, and I think that's fine. That would usually get you the contextualization point, but the contextualization point can actually be scored with information from the time frame, or even theoretically after the time frame, which never happens, but you could do that. All right, so you're situating the argument. So your argument is what you intend to prove. So in that first DBQ, if you were trying to prove that people were less religiously tolerant in 1200 than 1750, and you were trying to show how people were incorporated into armies throughout, then you're trying to answer the question of, well, why is it we got there? And you want to think about it like this. You want to think about if you were explaining this essay to somebody who had never studied history, what would you tell them? What would they need to know before they get into the actual essay? So it is not random background then. It has to be, as this says, immediately relevant to the question. And that is why, for some of you, my comment on your contextualization has been, this is too distant. It's too far in the past. It's too unrelated. It could not be construed as immediately relevant to the question. So immediately relevant to the question means it's answering some question, maybe a causation question about the prompt. And so I'm going to go through some examples using the DBQ that you addressed. So you have the states incorporating diverse populations and how it changed from around 1200 to around 1750. And so one of the questions you might want to answer is, what created diversity by 1200? The spread of Buddhism, the spread of Christianity, the conquest of areas by various empires. So what is it that created this diversity we're looking at, and what would have impacted diversity by 1750? This is where going in the time frame can be very useful. So for instance, you could talk about how the Spanish crossed the Atlantic and conquered the Aztecs and the Incas in your contextualization, because it doesn't tell us yet how they incorporated those diverse populations. So as long as you're not telling me how a state ruled over diverse populations, you can talk about it in your contextualization. All right, then you might want to talk about what states had developed by 1200. This was the most common version of contextualization that I saw from you guys. Many of you described the Mongol Empire and other empires. The Mongol Empire slightly after 1200 for many regions, but still basically context for the question, because it doesn't directly answer the question if you talk about how an empire developed. And then you might also want to talk about how the development of states pressured them to change by 1750. And so you might then talk about something that occurred in the meantime, like the Reformation in Europe or the Enlightenment. You know, those types of things impact this prompt, but they don't directly answer it. So what is relevant to the question? You want to think of it like there being a bullseye, and the center of the bullseye is the prompt, and you are zeroing in on the prompt. Okay, so if we were evaluating the extent to which trade was the primary factor driving intellectual transfer from 1200 to 1750, I want to take a different example and walk through the contextualization there. Then again, what we need is something immediately relevant to trade as a primary factor driving intellectual transfer. The time frame is broad. So again, don't be afraid to go into the time frame as long as you are identifying immediately relevant information that helps us to understand this. So if you were explaining to your parents this development of trade causing ideas to spread, what would you need to tell them before that? You'd probably need to tell them about trade routes in 1200, and that there was already a Silk Road, and that there was already trans-Saharan trade, and that there was already Indian Ocean trade by the time we get to 1200. It's already vibrant by 1200. And you might want to talk about certain ideas that had developed by 1200. The idea of how to produce a compass, or how to make paper, or how to make gunpowder. All those are ideas that would have developed by the time we get to 1200. And then you might also want to talk about trade routes that developed in between 1200 and 1750. So Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492. That's going to help out. And then new ideas that were developed as well. You have the scientific revolution, you have the Enlightenment, you have new versions of religions in other parts of the world. All right. So if you do have questions about that, make sure you let me know, because this is a point that you will have to score if you have as an ambition getting to that 5 range. Because if we break down the essay, I'm going to talk about some points that are a little bit easier to score. This is one of those points that's going to require background knowledge. And so all of those people who are overconfident that they're going to just be able to walk in on the day of the exam and use their notes and use their books to address the question, they might be able to score this, but they're going to run out of time. And so I'm thinking that the average score is probably going to be right around 3 out of 10 points. And so that would mean you would have to distance yourself from 3 out of 10 points if you were to score if you wanted to score in that 5 or 4 range. Okay, so the thesis, we're presenting a thesis that makes a historically defensible claim in response to all parts of the question. So let me go through this. A historically defensible claim means that it can't be true of all people in all time periods. And we've talked about this over the course of the year. So saying there was a positive and a negative effect, that's true of every development in history. So it tells us nothing. If you simply repeat the prompt, then you haven't told us anything that's historically defensible. So you have to tell us something that can be supported by the evidence, but isn't just empirically true. We don't just know it through factual evidence. All right? It must respond to all parts of the question. This is the most common area that students slip up on, because you'll respond to part of the question, but not the whole thing. And so in the first essay, we'll kind of go through what happened. And so as it says, this can consist of 1 or more sentences. So my suggestion for you has been to write a bridging thesis argument and then 2 full claims. Let's go through how that's going to work. So we've got evaluate the extent to which the way states incorporated diverse populations changed from around 1200 to around 1750. So your historical skill is change. You have to apply this to both claims. Now, with the DBQ, typically the skill has been something more like causation. And you could get away with applying this as a causation type of essay. But here, if it says change, then we need to have something that occurred in 1200 and then was different by 1750. It must be a comparison involving both time frames. The way states incorporated diverse populations, that's the key topic. So both the historical skill and the key topic must apply to all of your claims. And your evidence is going to come back to this key topic of states incorporating diverse populations. So the first sentence of the thesis is this thesis argument. You're going to have a statement looking back to the context. You're going to state all parts of the prompt, and then you're going to lead into your claims. And this has been a requirement all year, and I am still seeing essays where there is no thesis argument. Read the directions. Know what you want to do. Have a plan. Don't just walk in, just log in on the day of the exam and try to see what happens, right? So here we have a full-blown thesis argument. because of this expansion, so that's looking back to the contextualization. So in this particular case, we would have talked about expansion in the contextualization. We've got the ways states incorporated diverse populations changed in their approach to religious groups, but did not change in how they used groups in the military. And so that's the linking into the two claims. So how many sentences are you going to have in the thesis paragraph? I've recommended 2 for contextualization, 2 sentences for your contextualization for this version of the essay. And then you will have a thesis argument and 2 claims. That gets you to 5 sentences because the majority of the points are scored in the body part of this essay. You do not want to take too long on this part of the essay. You don't want to take too long on your thesis or your contextualization. So if we look at a claim, we would have states were more tolerant of the diverse religious groups they governed in 1750 than in 1200. There's change. There's the way states incorporated diverse populations. We've hit all of the parts of the question with this claim. So if you had a thesis argument and then you had 2 claims like this, you would certainly score the thesis. You would leave no doubt. In many years, you would have scored the thesis point with 1 claim. You wouldn't need 2. But that is a dangerous way to go. For one, you're going to write 2 body paragraphs anyway, so you might as well state the 2 claims here. But if one of your claims is wrong and one of them is right, you will still score the thesis if they're looking for a single claim. Don't play with fire and shoot for the minimum on a DBQ. If as much as you have time, you want to address this prompt as fully as you possibly can. So we have the other prompt that we talked about, the extent to which trade was the primary factor driving intellectual transfer. As a result of the development of these routes, so the trade routes were developed in your contextualization, trade was the primary factor in the spread of innovations in math and science, although wars played a secondary role in the spreading of manufacturing ideas. Many of you went with this kind of thesis argument. The other thing that this sets the stage for is scoring the complexity point down the line. If you have a clear argument that is carried through your essay, you are more likely to score that. All right, now, just to give you an example of the difference between your thesis argument with its 2 prongs, briefly stating your claims, and the full statement of the claim, we have trade was the primary factor, that's the key topic, and the spread of innovations in math and science. And then we've broadened this in our actual claim. Asian trade was the primary factor in the spread of innovations in math and science, particularly from the Middle East. We've brought it out a little bit. We've established it in a clearer way than we did initially. So we would then move on from this initial paragraph. You can use these claims as the topic sentences of your body paragraphs, and you should cite the documents at the end. The reason you're going to do that is that you're using the documents when you create this kind of claim, and you must use the documents in the body part of your essay. And the other thing that you're doing, again, is you're setting up potential complexity. You're setting yourself up so you can more easily score the evidence points with the documents. So then, evidence from the documents is worth 3 points. The thesis paragraph, remember, is worth 2 if you do both of those things correctly, whereas this now is worth 3. One of those points comes from this low bar item. This is an easy to score item on the rubric. Utilize the content of at least 2 documents, demonstrating understanding. You do not have to relate it back to the prompt in this case. You just have to show that you know what the document says. So 2 of these, demonstrate understanding, point, and just to give you an example of how this works, we've got document 3, according to the emperor, Muslims have been persecuted by Chinese officials. That doesn't tell us anything about the way states incorporated diverse populations. It doesn't relate to the prompt directly, but it does show understanding. So especially since this is a digital version of the exam and you could simply copy and paste parts of the document, quoting is going to do you 0 good. Do not quote from the documents. It's okay to lift a 2-word phrase or something similar and quote that in order to make a point. But broadly speaking, don't quote from the documents. And you can see why. If all I did was take a chunk of text from document 3 and put it into my essay, I've shown a person scoring the essay nothing, and only that I can copy and paste. And that's not one of the skills being evaluated here, right? Okay, so then the more difficult point So we get to 1 point for using. You could potentially get 2 points for utilizing the content to support the stated thesis. So the key part here is you get a point for 2 documents as long as they support the thesis or something related to the prompt. And then you can get another point if you use 2 more documents in addition. So if we take that first part, those 2 documents that you're using as evidence could be the same 2 documents that you demonstrated understanding of. So you can score 2 points basically for using just 2 documents in the body of your essay. In fact, if you relate those 2 documents to the prompt, you are likely to score both of those points. And this is what I mean by when I said that there are 3 points in the whole thing that are easy. So imagine that they were only looking for 1 claim in the thesis, and then you use 2 documents as evidence, and you, by using them as evidence, demonstrated understanding. You got yourself to a 3. And so it's not especially challenging to get to a 3. So that's why you have to score some of these other points. The way College Board traditionally tests the rubric out is they have college freshmen take the exam and they see how they would do. So you have to imagine that every college freshman that takes it is going to get these 3. So when we look at the more rarefied air, what are the high achieving college freshmen scoring that other students wouldn't score? It's going to involve you bringing in outside information or bringing in analytical skills. Okay, so now this is why I've said you have to use 5 documents in the body. If you look at the DBQs that you've written so far, both during this quarantine period and over the course of the regular school year, what you'll find is that many of you misused 1 document at least, or you failed to use it in such a way that it connected directly to the prompt. And so that is why you want some redundancy built in. If you use all 5 documents as evidence and you slip up once, then you still used 4 documents, which means you still get all 3 of the evidence points from the documents. So in your body, if you have 2 body paragraphs, you should score 3 evidence points. All right, so just to give you an example of the difference between evidence and use of the documents. Use of the documents, remember, does not relate directly to the prompt. And the prompt here had to be about states incorporating diverse populations. So this is according to the Yongjing Emperor. Muslims were originally outcast. They were now being included and tolerated religiously as they were able to practice their beliefs. So even though this person hasn't come right out and said, and that shows how states incorporated diverse populations, they have connected it directly enough that it's clear that Muslims were outcast, now being tolerated, right? So different state practice regarding diverse populations. That's how you score the evidence point. Some of you are still just doing summaries, and then you get straight into your sourcing, and then maybe you come back to the claim. That's a dangerous way to go, and you are depending a whole lot on readers to understand what it is you intend here. So what I recommend that you do is you state a document, the evidence from the document first, and then if you want to, you're going to go into sourcing. And so the sourcing here is going to involve 2 points as well. So 1 point for sourcing 1 document correctly. So remember, the AP scoring system is binary. It's either there or it isn't there. If you are part of the way through your sourcing, several of the steps are correct, then it's a 0. Right? It has to be all the way correct. So make sure you understand what we mean by sourcing. And I'm going to walk through that too at this point. So we've gone through a lot of essays, and some of you have proven immune to my teaching about sourcing so far. But since it's a little bit more urgent with the AP exam now imminent, some of you are ready to listen and you're ready to figure this out. And so make sure that you understand the process and then practice the process as we go through. All right, so just like with the evidence to earn the 2nd point, you just do it again. So this breaks down pretty nicely. If you have an additional piece of evidence and sourcing in your first body paragraph, and then you have the additional evidence and the sourcing in the second body paragraph, you're probably going to do what you need to do. Now, having more than 2 examples of sourcing that are correct is the best way to go, because it can both provide some redundancy just in case one of your sourcings doesn't meet the bar, and it can set you up for that complexity point. So let's look at the how we're doing this. We need to explain the significance. So here is the key there. Simply explaining the author's point of view or purpose or context is different from explaining the significance of the author's point of view, purpose, context, and so forth. Explaining the significance, you have to tell me, why is this important? Why do we care? This is not just a game you're playing where you're calling timeout and writing a DBQ, breaking away from using the documents as evidence, and engaging in this nice little trick you can perform where you source the documents. You have to weave this into the rest of your essay. And so here's what that's going to mean. First of all, explaining the significance means you tell me how the author's point of view, purpose, context, or audience impacted the document itself. What content in that document has been impacted, either in a way that makes it more credible or undermining its credibility by one of these things. And then the other way is to relate it back to the claim. I can tell you, if you skip that fifth step because you think that assessing the impact on the content is sufficient, you're not going to score this. This is what they've been looking for over the last 2 years. It has to come back to the prompt. If it doesn't tell us something more meaningful about the prompt, then it's not going to be scored as an explanation of the significance of the sourcing. All right, so then what we're going to do in order to get all of those pieces is, first of all, we're going to choose some part of the attribution that sets the stage. Most of you have this piece of it, right? So in the DBQ that you wrote, the first document was the Crusade document, where d'Aguilera was a crusader who is writing about how they butcher lots of people in Jerusalem. And so many of you at least attempted to source this document. We're going to run through some examples of this as well. All right, so then we need the analysis of the source. This attribution is going to lead to one single letter of cap. You're going to tell me about how the attribution relates to the context, or how it relates to the audience, or how it relates to the point of view, or how it relates to the purpose. Now, don't pick more than one of these. Be decisive. You're going to choose one. So, because he's a crusader, he believed it was his duty to conquer non-Christians. That has an impact on the document. And here we're choosing one letter of Coke. He's credible or he lacks credibility. He's omitted or specifically included. The information is known or unknown, exaggerated or downplayed. This should be a logical game. Because of this, then this, then this, which leads to this. If one of these steps is not logical, the whole thing kind of falls apart. So it is not as challenging, I don't think, as the additional evidence piece, the outside evidence, because there you're just pulling information out of thin air. Here you just need to figure out a logical way of presenting the information that is in the documents. The more you practice this, the more fluent you will be in it. And so be sure that you take yourself through this process well before you take the exam. So we've chosen out of Coke the omit, and we've gone with the opposite, which is specifically includes. I know that some of you have your favorite letters of cap and Coke, and you like to go with that all the time. That's fine, but if you have ambitions of scoring the complexity point, then you want to show some diversity here as much as you can. All right, now we need some example from the document. Now, if you're going with he omitted information, then you're obviously going to say he omitted something that's not in the document, but we still need an example. Here, it's a little bit more straightforward. We said he specifically included something, so we needed some example from the document that he would specifically include because he believes it's his duty to conquer non-Christians. So here we might go with the fact that he talks about how the blood of killed Jews in the temple of David, of Solomon, was, he actually says knee deep. I put calf deep here. And so then that relates us back to the connection to the prompt. How does this sourcing provide us new insight into the document? And again, why is it significant? And so this reveals just how strongly religions in 1200 promoted intolerance of other populations in the state. So remember, the prompt is asking you to evaluate the extent to which, that's a sliding scale. It could be a lot, a little. And so here it reinforces just how powerful this inclination was in 1200. So putting it all together, we've got this statement of sourcing. It's okay to break it up over 2 sentences, but here I've included it as 1 sentence, all the steps of sourcing. And because he's a crusader and believed it was his duty to conquer non-Christians, he specifically includes that the blood of killed Jews in the synagogue was calf deep, revealing just how strongly religions in 1200 promoted intolerance of other populations in a state. All right, so that's all of the steps. I know that's a lot, and kind of like a math formula that we just went over. And so it can be easy to kind of tune out that information. And so the best thing to do is to seriously practice it. And I don't mean practice it in name only, which is what some students did over the course of the year, where you knew it was required, so you put it in the essay, but you didn't really make yourself think about it. You have to go through the intellectual heavy lifting here of putting together a logical sequence. All right, I'm going to use some examples that I saw from the essays, and some of them are going to be examples that follow all the steps, and some of them are going to have missed out on some piece. All right, so we've got, because the author was working for the Crusaders in support of their motives, that would lead him to exaggerate the extent to which the bodies and blood covered the streets of Jerusalem. Okay, that's what I mean by not establishing a logical connection. Step 1 has been completed, step 2, step 3, but there's no logical connection between who this person is and the impact that they had on the content. How does working for the Crusaders and supporting their motives lead him to exaggerate? And so they come back around to it at the end. This information at the end, by making it seem easy so that many were killed, needs to be at the beginning. And because he was working for the Crusaders and wanted to make it seem that they easily took over Jerusalem, he exaggerated the number of people that they killed and the blood covering the streets of Jerusalem. All right, now we have to bring it back to states and diverse populations, which this example does not do. And so here it's a good example of how reading the document can actually derail you, right? You've had this situation where you read a document, and the document has such a strong voice that it brainwashes you and it distracts you from what you're trying to do. And that's what happened here. You're so horrified by this description of the slaughter in Jerusalem that you begin to focus on that rather than the prompt. Bring it back to the prompt. The whole thing is about addressing the prompt. Address the prompt that you've been given. All right, now we've got a different example. We've got he's French, which could have altered his perspective of the events to be much more graphic and glorious for himself. So the point here, so if we kind of look at this in terms of purpose, so you're saying because he's French, his purpose is to glorify the French, right? So that could lead him to exaggerate because he would think that this makes it seem like the French were great conquerors. But again, you need to play up that logical link and walking the reader through your sourcing. Because of this, then this, then this. And we don't need a lot of different information, a lot of different steps of CAP, which is what some of you kind of get lost in. All right, now this is an example of the type of document that many of you really struggle to source. Now the good news is, remember, you only need sourcing that's correct 2 times, possibly 3 in your essay. If you write 4 examples of sourcing, you have gone above and beyond, and that can really help down the line. But here, you want to at least have an idea of how you can source this. With images of various kind, it can often be helpful to go with context. The context, remember, that's part of CAP, that's the C. Because this was the context in which the painting was produced, then this happened, right? And so because the British East India Company's employees were a minority in India, so that's the context in which the creator is working. They needed to employ South Asians as soldiers, making the depiction of the Indian native wearing a soldier's outfit credible. reinforcing the continued need of states to incorporate diverse groups through the Army. So it hits all of the steps that we need. Now, the way to do this totally wrong is to say it's a painting, and paintings show things that were there, and so therefore it's credible as a painting. And so don't do that. Make sure you are a little bit more precise with how the creator of the painting impacted the content of the painting. All right, so then we take a different direction. Here we've gone with either purpose or perspective. The artist is part of the British East India Company, wants to show them in a positive light. So he's showing how the company included Indians as a way of making it seem that the company was actually better than it was in incorporating populations. Okay, so again, if you have any questions about the sourcing, be sure that you ask so we can get those ironed out. Because if we kind of go through what we've established so far, we've got contextualization, the thesis point, and 3 points for using the documents as evidence. Okay, so the contextualization point requires outside information, and it is a challenging point to score relative to those others. 3 of those points are pretty easy. Another point is definitely manageable, which is the evidence from 4 documents. All right, now we're getting to the rarefied error in the rubric. If you score 2 points for sourcing and you score 2 points for outside evidence, you're going to do well in the AP exam. You're going to outperform many of your peers. And so think about the overconfident people that you know who think that they're going to be able to rely on open notes and an open textbook and write this essay, and they are just going to run out of time. In addition to that, you're going to have lots of students across the country that are so intimidated by outside evidence and sourcing that they don't even try it. There's nothing there. They don't even make the attempt to include it. And so if you try this more than twice, if 1 or 2 of your examples is borderline, you're just going to be more likely to score it. So let's look at what it is we're scoring. So just like with the sourcing and the evidence from the documents, we've got one example scoring 1 point, a second example scoring an additional point. So let's talk about what we mean by an example. The example has to support or qualify the argument. And so if you were writing an argument that is based on the ruling of diverse populations and its changes from 1200 to 1750, then your example had better relate to states governing diverse populations within the time frame 1200 to 1750. It's possible to go outside of that time frame and still come up with something that is relevant, but much more difficult. And so that is why I would say stay away from that altogether. Have something that directly relates to the prompt. Okay, so here are the rules that I would give you in taking yourself through additional evidence. You should be sure that your evidence is from the time frame. Again, it's theoretically possible to come up with something outside of the time frame. Let's say you were talking about an empire that existed from 1200 to 1750, and it continued to act in a similar way after 1750 in its treatment of diverse populations. That could score as additional evidence, but it's unlikely that you're going to be able to make that connection. This has to be relevant to the prompt. All right, it has to be from the regions named in the prompt. Again, it's in theory possible to come up with something else, but I would say danger, danger there. Stay away from that. Addresses the key topic, included in the body. If it's part of your contextualization or your thesis, it's not going to score. Includes 2 to 3 named details not found in the documents, the prompt, or your contextualization. You cannot double score items in both your contextualization and your additional outside evidence. So even if it is referenced in a document, you cannot use it unless you are using it in an altogether new way. All right, so if we are evaluating the extent to which the states incorporated diverse populations, then you have to think, well, what could we talk about there that was not already in the documents? What was not covered in the documents? And some of you did a good job of bringing in information like the Mughal Empire. And so if we're trying to show that the Mughals established a state that was tolerant of various religions, it really helps to include these specific details. So the Mughals were increasing their tolerance towards religion outside the state. So they've established that Hinduism is not a state religion. It would be a little bit better to establish that Islam was the state religion. That would help to clarify the situation a bit. And then, so we've got Mughals as a name, Hinduism is mentioned in the document, so that does not score. Akbar as a name, and then we've got the Delhi Sultanate as a name. So we hit the 3 name details in there. This includes Akbar allowing Hindus to follow their religion and stopping the destruction of Hindu temples that had occurred at times during the reign of the Delhi Sultanate. Now, stopping the destruction of Hindu temples doesn't include a proper noun, but that would be included in the specific named details not found in the documents, because it's as a package, an example, right? So that would score. All right, now this is an example that would not have scored. So we've got trade was dominated by the Mongols, and while they were strict on their trade routes, religions like Buddhism and Hinduism were able to spread to different population groups, which were now considered outcasts by each individual state from their difference in culture. So this is easily fixed though. When you are writing, and especially in that 1 minute where you can kind of wrap up things, maybe during the submission time, take a look at this kind of thing, because here there are definite ways we can beef this up. We're able to spread to different population groups. Like what? Name one, right? Spread how? How did it get there? What population groups? And what is it that you're saying the Mongols did that would be considered tolerant? Which states are not treating them, these groups fairly? So these examples I would say here in particular, this is an example that all of you know. And so that's why we're going through the content, and we're looking at you applying the content in different ways, so that you will have ready examples to pull from on the surface of your brain while you're taking the AP exam, because it will be a race against time. And so we've now reached the point where you would have scored, hopefully, enough of the 9 points we've looked at that you'd be able to get a 5 on the AP exam, or a 4, right? So here again is an example. We've got the Ottoman Empire, the use of the Devshirme, which we talked about, the taking of Christian youths to serve in sometimes high level of the military, which proved effective in battle, having well-educated and trained individuals from birth. All right, so this is another example where if you establish the state religion, you would have clarified how this represents toleration, or how this represents a treatment of diverse populations, because you set up the diversity. So the use of religious tolerance is comparable to the Muslim Ottoman Empire's use of the Devshirme, makes it just a more persuasive type of statement. But that is the only tweak I think we have to make. Even though this example doesn't mention the Janissaries, it so clearly describes the Janissaries that we would score that as a detail. And so the Devshirme by itself is going to be attention grabbing, because it is such a specific term. So this is why, when you go through the chart, I had you include those details. The more those details, those names, you can just produce on a moment's notice, the more likely you are to score this kind of thing. That brings us to the last point, which is the complexity point. The complexity point is not a point that I have had you aim for by itself. In fact, we've made several changes to this DBQ that, like eliminating these linking statements, that would actually make it easier to score complexity. But the reason for that is, again, that I think you can score the complexity by doing other parts of the essay really well. And since the complexity point is so hard to score, it is so rare. Last year on the DBQ, it was 1 in 1,000 essays scored the complexity point. So because of that, you are far better off chasing the points that we know you can score. And then if you happen to score this on the way, great. If you don't, then it's not that big a deal. So don't get so caught up in this that you're losing sight of the other points. If you source 3 times well, and you include 3 additional examples that go beyond the document, and you did everything else, your essay is going to be great, and you're going to score what you need to score. So here what we're saying is, you need to have a cohesive argument. So that starts with your thesis. If you laid out an argument in your thesis, and then in each of the topic sentences you brought it back, and you make reference to it somehow in the body, that could score you complexity. And so let's take a look at some other ways that you could do that to score that complexity point. So the main way is by illustrating explicitly relationships among historical evidence, such as contradiction, corroboration, and or qualification. So if you can get the documents to talk to each other, you are likely to score this point. And if you can't, then not a big deal, right? The primary objective is to score the document evidence. If on the way you manage to do this, fantastic. If you don't, there are other ways to get to a 5 than doing this. But here's what we mean by that. There are documents in each DBQ that are closely related. And if you explain the close relationship between the document, either by a really solid topic sentence or by making linking statements between the evidence or at the end of the paragraph, then that can show complexity. If you find that there are two documents that seem to contradict each other, and you can find a way to explain how that contradiction can occur, then you can score the complexity point. So here's an example. Here are two documents that corroborate each other. They are saying essentially the same thing. So the first document is the second document in the DBQ that you wrote, which talks about how the Fatimid Caliphate in North Africa created a multi-ethnic army. They had these people in the army, and these people in the army, and these people in the army. And then we have the British employing Indians as sepoys in the illustration. And so if you relate these two together and you show how there is a similar policy for governing diverse populations, it kind of sets the stage for potential scoring of the complexity point. On the other hand, here we have contradiction. The first document shows European intolerance, and the second document shows European tolerance. So it's not enough to say that there was a change in tolerance. To indicate the relationship among the evidence, you probably would have to explain what it is that caused this to change, like the Enlightenment. So if you were to, in employing the document to the right as evidence, reference the Enlightenment as a way of contextualizing the document, then you would make it more likely to score the complexity point. I don't recommend, again, going out of your way to do these things, because even if you do, if they're embedded in the body of your essay, they can be easy for a reader to overlook. And so doing this instead of sourcing the correct number of times or using the correct number of outside examples is just not a good strategy. It is not how the game is played. And so what I will tell you is that as a reader who has scored the DBQ, it was far more common for a DBQ to score a complexity because they did multiple things really well. So complexity basically means you wrote a really good essay. And so here is what can indicate that you wrote a really good essay. If you did two of these things in your essay, you, in all likelihood, if you did them well, could score the complexity point. So in other words, if you had 3 correct sourcing analyses and 3 correct pieces of additional evidence, your essay would be so far beyond the average essay that a reader has scored that they would be, at the very least, sorely tempted to score the complexity point for you. And then again, as I've said, you can engage in an explicit discussion of the relationship between documents. You can engage in an explicit discussion of the relationship between claims. So you might explain how, as some of you have become really good at doing, explain how one claim was the more significant of your 2 claims. And it has to be an explicit discussion. It can't be most importantly, and that's it. Less importantly, and that's it. You have to express why one is more important, why one's less important. You can score this through an outside connection as well, establishing a connection to another place or time. But again, writing that instead of writing additional examples of sourcing or outside evidence is crazy. Don't do that. Focus on the meat of the essay. If you do a really good job of addressing the documents as evidence, and you do a really good job of sourcing, and you do a really good job of outside evidence, you're going to score the complexity point. It'll take care of itself. And if you don't score the complexity point, you can still get to a 5. Now the other way around, and we talked about all these points, if, however, you've just decided outside evidence and contextualization So that would be all of the outside information you could bring in are not things you can score. That's 3 points out of a 10-point essay, 30% of the essay that you're just willing to flush away. That puts a lot of pressure on you to be perfect everywhere else in the essay. And if you aren't, that's how you fall from a 4 to a 3 or a 3 to a 2. You have